thought grief was the hardest thing I'd face after my husband died. Turns out, grief is gentle compared to betrayal. My name is Clara Winslow. Last spring, my daughter inherited our mansion and 8 million credits. Me, I got a dusty warehouse on the edge of the Western energy belt, and 5 words my husband left just for me. She'll know where to look. The lawyer's office felt like a museum that forgot it was supposed to be alive. Glass walls, chrome edges, a polite AI voice rolling out legal phrases with the warmth of an ice cube. I sat in a simple black coat, hands folded in my lap the way my mother taught me when I was young and poor and determined. Across from me, my daughter Fiona lounged into the leather chair like it was a victory throne. Silver hover sedan outside, razor-edged heels, hair pinned so perfectly it looked untouchable. The following are the last wishes of Richard Winslow, the AI intoned, its light flickering over the table. I swallowed. 37 years of marriage. A home built board by board, paycheck by paycheck, through energy shortages, layoffs, and one wicked winter when the pipes broke and we boiled snow on the stove. To Fiona Winslow, the residence on Aspen Ridge, all corporate shares, liquid accounts, and credit energy reserves, totaling approximately 8 million credits. I waited for the part that balanced the scale, the part where my husband, my partner, my co-architect in everything remembered me. To Clara Winslow, property at Sector 12, Western Energy Belt including the warehouse facility and all contents contained therein. Addendum in testator's handwriting. She'll know where to look when the world burns. Silence. Even the human assistant blinked like the script had glitched. Fiona turned, mouth curving into something that might have passed for sympathy if not for the spark in her eyes. "I guess Dad believed in merit," she murmured, which was a very elegant way to say mine. I stared at the digital signature. It was Richard's. The slant of the R, the unnecessary flourish on the D. He'd planned this, down to the last cruel comma. We stepped out into spring sunlight that felt too bright, like someone had turned up the saturation on a bad memory. Fiona was already on a call before the doors closed behind us. "Yes, transfer the utilities to my name, and schedule the interior team. Aspen Ridge gets a full retrofit." That night we sat at the old oak table Richard and I had sanded ourselves. I set dinner out of habit. Habit is what grief wears when it can't find a coat. Fiona didn't touch the food. "Mom," she said, brisk and tidy, "you'll need to vacate by Friday. I have contractors coming Monday." I kept my voice even. "This is my home." She gave me a careful smile. "It was, Mom. Let me help you load the truck. The warehouse is big. You'll have space." She made space sound like a consolation prize wrapped in sandpaper. I looked for the child I'd walked to school in second-hand boots. The teenager who cried in my lap after her first debate loss. I couldn't find her anywhere on that polished face. "Fiona," I said quietly, "your father and I built this. You don't have to erase me to own it." She sighed like the grown-up in the room humoring a sentimental grandmother. "You'll be fine. You always are." The next days moved with the slow efficiency of a foregone conclusion. Fiona supervised every box. "Not that one," she said, tapping the china set my mother gave me. "It stays with the house." A family photo slid from a frame and cracked on the floor. She didn't look down. By Friday afternoon, the truck was full of what you can carry when respect is not included. I stood in the doorway one last time and pressed my palm to the wall where Richard used to mark our daughter's height in pencil. The marks were painted over years ago. You could still feel the grooves if you knew where to touch. Fiona stood at the foot of the stairs, new codes already programmed into the home system. "Good luck," she said, then softer, as if practicing empathy, "The belt's not so bad." "Wear a mask," I said. "The dust gets into everything." She didn't understand that I meant everything. The Western Energy Belt was a graveyard of yesterday's solutions. Rusted turbines like bone, cracked solar glass kicked up from the ground like seashells on a beach that had forgotten water. The warehouse sat alone, hunched against the wind, a long rectangle of corrugated metal and time. The gate shrieked when I pushed it. Inside, darkness. A smell of old machine oil and dry paper. My footsteps echoed, and the echo sounded like a second person who didn't want to be there either. No water, no grid. I found an emergency lantern in a storage cabinet and a thin blanket rolled tight as a rebuke. Night blew through the seams and found all my bones. I slept on the office floor under a window stained with decades of dust, and a hint of sunset I pretended was a blessing. The calls started on day 3. Cousins I hadn't seen in years offering advice dressed as concern. "We heard you're challenging the will, Clara. Maybe don't make a scene. Fiona's under a lot of pressure." Pressure. I closed my eyes and saw my hands 20 years ago, raw from sanding wood when we couldn't afford to replace the stairs. Pressure is a different thing when you can't hire someone to carry it for you. On day 5, I found a broom with half its bristles gone and began to sweep. Movement is a prayer when your heart has forgotten the words. I cleared a path across the main floor, past dead terminals and a long, silent assembly line we once dreamed would change everything. Dreams fossilize when no one visits them. I didn't cry. I made tea instead from water I'd hauled in a plastic tank and told myself out loud, "You will figure this out." On day 7, the wind was vicious, shoving against the walls like an angry guest. A metal panel rattled, then settled. I walked the perimeter, checking bolts, grazing my fingers over old stenciled labels, hydrogen control. Battery bay, offline storage. I stopped at the last one, offline storage. The paint was chipped. The edges of the panel were newer than they should have been. I knocked. Hollowness answered, a precise, engineered hollowness. Richard used to say the right secret makes a different sound. I pressed my ear to the cold metal and laughed once short, disbelieving. "You impossible man," I whispered into the seam. "What did you do?" Night fell before I could find a tool that would fit the fasteners. The lantern sketched a small circle of light around my hands as I worked. Somewhere in the dark, a memory uncoiled. The way Richard's eyes lit when he solved something hard, the way he'd look at me after and say, almost shy, "Couldn't have done it without you." I used to say the same thing back and mean it. The panel didn't open that night. My hands cramped and my breath fogged and the wind got meaner. I lay back on the office floor and stared at the ceiling. Through a slit in the dust, a line of stars held. It was enough. In the morning, I tried again. The wrench bit. The last fastener gave with a grudging click. The panel slid, heavy and slow, and a rectangle of stale, cold air spilled out. A narrow cavity, dark as a secret, waited. Inside, a small, cracked plastic sleeve. I drew it out carefully, the way you lift a newborn head before the neck is ready. A metal keycard, old school, 2030s vintage, pre-biometric. Next to it, a pocket hologram projector, scratched but intact. My hands shook as I wiped the projector lens with the hem of my coat. The power cell indicator blinked at me like a tired eye. I plugged it into a portable battery. I'd charged off an old panel I coaxed back to life and pressed the activation stud. Blue light fanned out in a weak cone and settled into a schematic of the warehouse, layer upon layer, each line familiar as the crease of my palm. The projection flickered, recalibrated, and then revealed something the original plans never showed. A thin, bright rectangle beneath the western wing. A room with no door. Beneath the image, a handwritten note floated, captured in an old scan. Richard's penmanship. The flourish on the D. She'll know where to look. I felt the strangest thing, like the air had shifted from winter to the first hour of spring. Not joy, not even hope. Focus. I powered the projector down and held the keycard in my fist until it warmed to my skin. The dust shelter had looked like exile. It suddenly looked like a map. I set my jaw the way I do when a problem invites me to quit. "All right, Richard," I said into the humming dark. "Let's see what you left me." Outside, the wind whipped the scrub into frantic bowing. Inside, something steadied. I wasn't the widow who got sent to the edge of nowhere anymore. I was an engineer with a key in her hand. And for the first time since the will was read, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. The night was silent except for the wind pressing against the warehouse walls. Lantern light flickered over my face as I stood in front of the western wing panel, the holographic schematic still etched in my mind. That glowing, hidden rectangle beneath the floor haunted me, a room with no door. For several days, I searched every seam and wall panel like an engineer tracing a heartbeat. On the fourth morning, just as dawn crept through the cracks, I found it, a faint vibration behind an old power control panel. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't rot. It was something alive, mechanical, a lock. I slid the keycard into a narrow slot on the panel. At first, nothing. Then, a heavy metallic click echoed through the wing. A section of the walls slid open with a breath of stale air, as if the building had finally exhaled after decades of holding its secrets. Behind it, a narrow staircase led downward into darkness. Each step felt like walking back in time. Back to the years Richard and I spent designing off-grid systems, back to the nights when we believed technology could outlast greed. At the bottom stood a reinforced vault door, the surface etched with two intertwined letters, C+R. My hands shook as I ran the keycard through the lock. A soft, mechanical hum answered. The door opened. I stepped inside and froze. Rows of quantum data drives hummed softly, like a chorus of sleeping machines. Shelves of documents sealed in plastic lined the walls, and in the center of the room sat a small metal box engraved with Richard's handwriting. I knelt down, lifted the box, and opened it. Inside was a letter, real paper, his handwriting. "For Clara, if you're here, you found it." I unfolded it slowly, lantern light brushing across the page. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means the world has done what it always does, reward appearances, not substance. Fiona inherited the house and the credits because she understands money. But you understand systems. What you found is our true legacy, patents, energy prototypes, mineral rights, and contracts tied to no one but us. They're offline, invisible to Fiona's lawyers. When the world burns, knowledge is worth more than gold." Tears blurred the ink. I wiped them quickly, afraid to smudge the only part of him I had left in this place. "Fiona will spend what she has. She always has. But you will build. You always have. And when the time is right, this archive will give you the freedom no law or inheritance ever could. I trust you to know when that moment comes. I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. For months, I had been the widow cast out to the dust, the woman everyone pitied. But sitting there in that cold underground chamber, surrounded by humming machines, I understood the truth. Richard hadn't abandoned me. He had armed me. Above ground, Fiona was living in luxury, remodeling her inheritance like a queen. But down here, in the silence, I held the real power. And she had no idea. While I spent my days cataloging Richard's archive and quietly meeting with lawyers from outside the state, Fiona was busy building a glass empire. Every gossip feed in Aspen Ridge had her face on it. She hosted elegant parties under solar glass ceilings, gave interviews about responsible inheritance, and remodeled the mansion like it was a set piece in a movie about winning. She wasn't winning. She was burning through everything. 2 months after the will, she bought 3 hover sedans, renovated the house with imported European panels, invested in 2 high-risk energy startups, and flew to the Europa Orbital Resort with a circle of lawyers and influencers. She moved like the money would never end. But inheritance is not income, and arrogance has an expiration date. I first heard the whispers in the bank lobby. I had gone to file some legal transfers related to the mineral rights in Richard's documents. Behind me, two tellers spoke in hushed tones. "She's back again. Another credit energy loan. Third one this quarter." They didn't need to say her name. There was only one she that everyone whispered about in Aspen Ridge. By the 6th month, the cracks were impossible to hide. 2 of her investments collapsed. The third was frozen due to regulatory audits. Her credit reserves were leveraged beyond repair. Contractors began whispering that she'd missed payments. Lawyers she once charmed started sending reminders with firmer wording. Meanwhile, I was quietly closing deals. Richard's patents and mineral rights had drawn the attention of international energy consortiums. I didn't sell immediately. I negotiated, slowly, methodically. Every contract was written to keep control in my name. By the time Fiona's financial walls started shaking, I was sitting on secured agreements worth tens of millions of credits, all protected behind legal firewalls she couldn't touch. Then came the night she knocked on my door. It had been raining for hours, a heavy, relentless storm that beat against the warehouse like a warning drum. I heard the engine before I saw the lights. Her once sleek hover sedan sputtered down the muddy road, landing unevenly on the gravel. When she stepped out, her heels sank into the mud. Her perfect hair clung to her face. Her blazer hung soaked and heavy. She banged on the steel door with the side of her fist. Her voice cracked through the storm. "Mom, Mom, open up." I opened the door slowly. She stood there shivering, mascara streaking, no trace of the lawyer who had once told me I didn't belong in my own home. "I need to talk to you," she said. Her voice wasn't commanding anymore, it was small, raw. For a moment, I simply looked at her. Not the woman who inherited the mansion. The girl who used to race through Richard's lab with a flashlight, asking endless questions. That girl was buried under layers of entitlement, but she wasn't gone. I stepped aside. She walked in, dripping rainwater onto the concrete floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, scanning the dim interior like she was seeing it for the first time. "I've made some mistakes," she whispered. The storm outside howled against the walls, but inside everything was still. For months, she had held the house, the wealth, the spotlight. I had held nothing. Now, as she stood in my doorway, I understood exactly what Richard meant. He trusted me to wait, and now the waiting was over. She stood in the center of the warehouse, dripping onto the concrete floor, her expensive shoes leaving muddy prints on the gray surface. The storm still pounded outside, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between us. "Sit," I said. She obeyed without hesitation, lowering herself onto the same metal chair I had used on my first night here, when the wind rattled the walls and I'd thought I had lost everything. Now, she looked like the one standing on the edge of collapse. I set a kettle on the small induction plate I had installed months earlier. It clicked softly as it heated. She watched me, waiting for me to speak first. I didn't. I let the silence do the work. People who are used to control get uncomfortable in silence. By the time the kettle hissed, her hands were twisting in her lap. "Mom," she finally said, "I'm in trouble." Her voice cracked, the way it used to when she was a child trying to hide a bad grade. But she wasn't a child anymore. She was a woman who had inherited everything and thought it would last forever. I poured tea into 2 chipped mugs and set one in front of her. She didn't touch it. "How much?" I asked. She looked away. "Fiona." Her eyes met mine. 400,000 credits. I thought I had more time. I thought the returns would come in sooner. I made bad investments. I overspent. I nodded slowly. "And now you've come here." She swallowed. I didn't know who else to turn to. I sat down across from her. "Do you remember the night you told me to vacate the house?" Her face went pale. Mom, no, I want you to remember it. You stood at the top of the stairs with your arms folded like a judge handing out a sentence. You gave me 1 week to pack my life into boxes. You told me I'd be fine. She lowered her eyes. Rain slammed against the metal roof. I could give you the money, I said, but I won't, not like that. Her head snapped up. Please, I'll pay you back. Oh, I know you will, I said calmly. Because this isn't charity, this is a contract. She froze. A contract? I leaned forward, elbows on the table. You're a lawyer, Fiona. You should appreciate structure. Here are my terms. She straightened in the chair instinctively, like she was back in a negotiation room. But this wasn't her boardroom. This was mine. I'll loan you 500,000 credits, I began. Enough to cover your debts and give you a small buffer. Interest rate 5% annually. 10-year repayment plan. She nodded quickly. That's better than any bank. I'll sign whatever you need. I'm not done. She flinched. I continued. For the next 5 years, you'll come here every Saturday. You'll work on this property. Maintenance, repairs, organization. Whatever I need, you'll clock in like anyone else. No excuses. Her mouth opened, then closed. She nodded. Every time you step foot here, you'll speak to me with respect. No cutting remarks, no condescension. You will treat me as the mother you cast aside but who chose to help you anyway. Do you understand? Yes, Mom. And lastly, I said, my voice steady, you will write a letter of apology. Full, honest, and signed. You will read it aloud to the entire family at the next winter gathering. Every lie you told, every humiliation you inflicted, every ounce of disrespect you showed me, correct it publicly. Her face drained of color. That's humiliating. I didn't blink. Humiliating is being kicked out of your home after 37 years of marriage. Humiliating is hearing whispers about you at the grocery store because your daughter painted you as a bitter old woman. This is not humiliation. This is accountability. She stared at the floor for a long time. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes. I'll do it. I didn't smile. Good, then we have a deal. The storm outside began to ease. Inside, something had shifted. For the first time in years, Fiona wasn't in control, and I wasn't begging. I slid the draft contract across the table. She picked up the pen with trembling fingers and signed. When she left that night, the mud on her heels was heavier than when she'd arrived. But the weight she carried now wasn't just from the rain. It was from the terms. The first Saturday she showed up, she wore jeans and an old sweatshirt. No makeup, no jewelry. It was the first time in years I'd seen her dressed like someone with work ahead of her instead of a performance to give. She stood awkwardly at the entrance of the warehouse, holding a pair of gloves I'd left out for her. "What do you want me to start with?" she asked. The voice was hesitant, stripped of its usual sharp edges. I pointed toward the back shed. "Storage. Everything in there needs to be sorted and cleaned. You'll find tools inside." She nodded and got to work. The shed was cramped and dusty, stacked high with forgotten equipment and documents that had survived decades of weather. She coughed through the first hour but didn't complain. Not once. That became the rhythm. Every Saturday Fiona came, rain or shine. She swept, scrubbed, lifted, and carried. She organized shelves, patched leaks, sorted cables, labeled drives. Her hands blistered the first few weeks. She taped them and kept working. And slowly, something shifted. The arrogance that had once coated every word began to thin out. She started asking real questions. She listened when I explained how the old energy systems worked. She stopped giving short, defensive answers. When she didn't understand something, she admitted it. I didn't make it easy for her. I didn't praise her too quickly or pretend the past hadn't happened. But I didn't humiliate her either. I gave her space to confront her own actions in the silence between tasks. One afternoon in early autumn, as we were raking the yard outside the warehouse, she paused, leaning on her rake, sweat streaking her forehead. "Mom," she said, her voice low, "do you think you'll ever really forgive me?" I leaned on my rake too, looking out at the tree line beyond the fence. The leaves had begun to turn, the kind of slow, deliberate change that doesn't ask for permission. Forgiveness isn't something I hand out like a receipt, I said. It happens when change is real, when it lasts. She nodded. There was no protest, no self-defense, just quiet acceptance. The months passed. Fiona kept showing up. The shed became organized, the property cleaner, the old warehouse less like a place of exile and more like a base of operations. Meanwhile, my negotiations with energy companies were closing. The contracts were finalized. The royalties began to flow. But I didn't move back into luxury. I stayed. I kept my routines. I brewed tea the same way I had on the first night, but now in a kitchen I'd renovated with my own plans. The warehouse no longer felt like a punishment. It felt earned. Fiona changed too. She sold 2 of her hover sedans. She stopped traveling. She rebuilt her legal practice with a new focus, family restructuring, small estate protections, legal education for low-income clients. I heard about it from other people first, not from her. She didn't brag. She worked. By the end of the 5th year, the debt was nearly repaid, but the more important debt, the emotional one, had started to settle in quiet, unspoken ways. She arrived early on Saturdays. She stayed late. She no longer carried herself like a woman protecting a crown, but like a woman trying to build something honest. One winter afternoon, after finishing a long day clearing the West Wing's archives, she set down her gloves and looked at me across the room. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up on me," she whispered. I didn't answer right away. I just nodded, a small, slow nod. Some things don't need speeches, they just need time. Exactly 1 year after the night Fiona knocked on my door, she arrived at the warehouse on a crisp winter morning and found it empty. The gates were open. The main floor swept clean, the shelves labeled, the machines humming quietly as if waiting for a new purpose. On the metal door, taped with a single strip of white tape, was a handwritten note in my steady script. "Follow the ridge road." She drove up the old dirt path, tires crunching over frozen ground. The morning light spilled over the ridge like liquid gold, and then she saw it. On the hill overlooking the valley stood a new structure. A modern glass and steel estate, elegant and quiet, built with clean lines and deliberate restraint. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. But it commanded presence. It was everything Richard and I had dreamed of creating and everything Fiona had never imagined I could build. I stood on the terrace, a cup of coffee in my hand, watching her car approach. She got out slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. For a long time, she just stared at the building, then at me. "Mom," she said softly, "what is this?" I smiled, not with triumph, but with calm. "Home." I led her through the halls. She touched the glass walls, ran her fingers along polished steel beams, paused at the expansive view over the valley. In the central room, the heart of the estate, stood a reinforced door with familiar initials engraved in the steel, C+R. "This is Richard's work," she whispered. "It's ours," I corrected. The archive, once buried beneath dust and rust, had been rebuilt, integrated, legally fortified, contracts finalized, mineral rights and patents secured. Energy companies were now licensing technologies under my name. Not hers, not anyone else's. Mine. Fiona turned to me. Her face was a mixture of awe and something else, respect. "You could have told me," she said. "Yes," I answered. "But then you wouldn't have learned, and I needed to see who you'd become without the safety net." She lowered her gaze. "I almost lost everything." "You did lose everything," I replied gently. "And then you started to rebuild, that matters more." We stood in silence for a while. There was no dramatic music, no sudden apologies, no tears that fixed everything. Just 2 women, mother and daughter, standing in a place that had been earned, not inherited. Later that spring, at the annual family gathering, Fiona kept her final promise. She stood before everyone in Linda's living room, holding the letter she had written, her hands steady. She spoke clearly, owning every word. She admitted the lies, the cruelty, the arrogance. She asked for forgiveness without demanding it. The room was silent when she finished. Not cold, not condemning, just silent. And in that silence, something shifted. Not the past, but the weight of it. After dinner, Linda hugged me tightly. "Clara," she whispered, "you built something bigger than any inheritance." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That night, I returned to the Ridge estate. From the terrace, I could see the valley lights below, small and scattered like the stars that used to shine through the broken warehouse window. Fiona called as I sat down with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. "Good night, Mom," she said. "And thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For believing there was still something left in me to save." When I hung up, the house was quiet, not empty, just full of a different kind of silence, the kind that comes after a long storm has finally passed. Richard had been right. The house, the money, the lawyers, they were never the real inheritance. The real legacy was patience, resilience, strategy, and the quiet strength to rebuild without announcing it to the world. Fiona thought she'd inherited everything. But in the end, it was I who held the foundation.